certainly the day has got longer. In terms of productivity, there's like a classic split here between short and long run. So short run, which is doing the same thing you've ever done before. Typically, I'm hearing overwhelmingly people are more productive. So, I've seen this in research. I'm running surveys of companies. In fact, earlier today, I was talking to a government office out in New Jersey. Actually, they were saying, look, one of the managers, she was saying her employees are basically doing the same old repetitive coding tasks. They'd be much more productive because you get peace and quiet at home and you avoid the commute. The problem in productivity is creativity, like new ideas and new innovations.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum, and we're continuing our transformation series today, looking at the ways in which COVID has acted as an agent of change in our lives. Today, as we witness many countries beginning to open up again, we're going to examine the end of the office and how the pandemic has affected your work-life balance. This topic elicits all sorts of different responses depending on your work, your living situation, your commuting time, your gender, and the flexibility of your work options. Many people can't wait to get back into their office cubicle, while others prefer a hybrid work schedule. More workers still have absolutely no choice. So what happens to us when we merge work and life space? Is there something valuable about having a separate work area and real interaction with live colleagues? Those with children, of course, will somehow continue to juggle all the pieces. We're fortunate to have two great guests today who are going to help us examine the latest research and consider the key issues. Of course, we also want to hear from you with your questions and opinions. So let us get started. Let me introduce first Nick Bloom, Professor of Economics at Stanford University, who specializes in management practices and uncertainty, and also welcome to Brad Harrington, who is Executive Director of Boston College's Center for Work and Family, and is a research professor at the Carroll School of Management. So let's rewind first, back in March 2020, when the pandemic struck. Work and life were impacted as never before. The responses, however, were very industry dependent and created different challenges depending on which job sector you occupied. A, knowledge workers who shifted to remote working. B, essential workers like paramedics, baristas, delivery drivers, supermarket cashiers, etc. They were expected to show up and take risks. And C, those who were laid off. Estimates are 4.5 million for women and 3.7 million for men. They suddenly found themselves in dire financial circumstances. So first, let's go to you, Brad. Welcome.
Hi, well, thank you.
What happened on the home front during the past year, and what changed, and how are families positioned going forward?
Well, I think to go back, Mary, to the little framework you just introduced, which was this, the issues were different for people depending on the industry or the type of industry they worked in. I think the common denominator was stress, regardless of what industry. But as you said, if you were made redundant because you were in an industry that really had to close down, there was a lot of financial stress that was there. If you were an essential worker, there was stress and worry about the health and well-being of you and your family as you came back home. And if you were a knowledge worker who was lucky enough to be able to work from home, I think the stress came from trying to find some kind of a space between work and family when the two were just inextricably tied together. So it was different on all fronts. Obviously, people referred to this as people are working from home, but I think that's really a miscategorization. People were working from home and doing caregiving and childcare and homeschooling at the same time, at least obviously for parents. And so it wasn't just simply a matter of working from home. It was really a matter of people trying to juggle two full-time jobs, often at the same time. And, I think about how difficult that was for couples. But when I think about the high percentage of single parent heads of household in the United States, it's really hard to imagine how parents were able to cope with all the difficulties that this entailed.
So that's a great summation of all the problems. So let's shift to you, Nick, to talk about the factors economically speaking. So we all know the workplace transformed for about half the population, I think. And looking at the shifting trends in working from home, I think I'm right in saying that some working from home had already started in the high-tech sector pre-2020. But I think the pandemic made us realize how many things we could actually do virtually, like this program, for example, on Zoom, which used to be live with people. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about the transformation of the workplace. Who was doing it before? Who's doing it now?
Sure. So you know, to give you some rough, to give you some rough numbers, before the pandemic, it was something like 15% of people ever worked from home, and mostly they did it occasionally. So before the pandemic, only about 2% of people worked from home full time. So that's like really rare. Basically, no one pre-pandemic worked from home full time. You know, there are a few people, like a friend of mine. She moved to New York and her husband moved with her and he kept his job and so he worked from home, but they're pretty unusual individuals. And then during the pandemic, around half of Americans were working from home full time. They tended to be college grads, you know, probably most of your listeners, you know, kind of higher earning professional jobs. As Brad mentioned, there are about the other half that couldn't work from home, but still half of the US is working from home full time. Post-pandemic, looking ahead, what's by far the most common thing when I'm speaking to firms and organizations is hybrid. So for those of us that can work from home or working from home full time, would like to go to probably 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week at home. And for the other half, they weren't doing it before, they're not going to do it post-pandemic. So we have this kind of two-speed economy. Working from home, half of us are getting to do it full time. We're going to go back to 3 days a week. The other half basically have had, as you know, Brad said, a pretty horrible pandemic in the sense of had to go into work or they've lost their job. They're not going to get this working from home perk either post-pandemic.
So I'll come back to whether that's a perk or not, working from home in a moment with all the other stresses involved. But you said the people that did working from home pre-pandemic were doing it pretty much out of choice. But post-pandemic, you're saying people have to think about four things when they're thinking about their working from home option. One is their privacy, one is their space, 3 is choice, and 4 is children. So before I ask Brad about that, why are those considerations important?
Well, you know, I oddly enough have been working from home now for about 15 years. So I used to, you know, for years was talking to companies that had some working from home pre-pandemic, and they'd always say, you know, for example, I visited JetBlue out in Salt Lake City. I remember spending a while out there. If anyone's flown on JetBlue, if you ever rung up their call center, you're probably speaking to someone that was working from home. And they said, you know, many companies said, if you're going to work from home, you have to have your own room, it has to not be your bedroom, and they have to, you know, give good broadband and no kids around. And typically, for most people, all 4 of those have been broken under the pandemic. So working from home during the pandemic is, you know, often not fantastic. I have, you know, young kids running around, you know, it's very sweet. I get stuff like this, you know, little gifts get brought to me all the time, but it's very hard to concentrate. So post-pandemic, working from home will be a lot better. And I think we'll go back to having our own room that we can work on throughout the day that is not our bedroom, which is pretty kind of depressing to be in your bedroom working during the day. And hopefully broadband for most people will be a lot better if you're the only person at home, since you only got one use on the broadband connectivity.
Brad, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would say, you know, we have a roundtable at Boston College, and it's got about 55 member organizations, and they're all companies that are very large, very global, and very well respected in sort of the human resource and workforce management space. And I think, you know, Nick is talking generally about how many people work from home. The companies we work with, a lot of them have a significant portion of their workforce work from home. And one of the benefits that they've enjoyed through the pandemic was, if I could say enjoyed during the pandemic, that sounds like it's a contradiction in terms, but was the fact that, you know, the business continuity was very, very good. So as other organizations said, oh my gosh, you know, suddenly we're going to have half or more of our workforce working from home. How are we going to cope with that? Some of these organizations like the Big Four and the tech companies and so forth, they just, you know, literally it was like, okay, instead of doing it part-time, do it full-time. And the ability to kind of keep the business up and running was much, much better for people who had not only been experimenting, but had been seeing this as just a different way of working over the years. And so for those organizations, this was a relatively seamless transition. For those who are just putting their toe in the water or were very resistant to this, it was much more of a traumatic event for those employers, I think.
Before we go into that a bit more, just personally speaking, you two both are fathers, and you've both been working from home. Mm-hmm. What's been the biggest stressor for each of you?
Well, I'll start for me. It's been the stress my wife has felt seeing me 24 hours a day. That's been by far the biggest one. We have a nephew who has a beautiful condo in downtown Boston on Newbury Street. He's one of our wealthy nephews. And my wife found out that he was going to Florida for 5 weeks in late January and February. And I can't tell you how fast she packed her bags and said, I just need a little space.
That's really
Nick's got younger kids, so.
Yeah, I think for me, the big issue is being kids, actually. So I have 4 kids, and my youngest is 5. And particularly for the younger ones, homeschooling really doesn't work. I mean, the Zoom schooling is very hard. The teacher's making a fantastic job of it. Can you imagine trying to teach kindergartners on Zoom? It's just impossible. And so she's kind of marauding around the place. I come into the room where she's supposed to be on Zoom, and she's lying on the floor, or watching TV or something. So that hasn't worked well. Now the 3 older ones have gone back to school. They're slowly going back, but that's tricky because I'm driving twice a day because there's no school bus. So you can imagine what happens, of course.
Wow.
So, my wife and I split the driving, but post-COVID, again, working from home is fantastic, but under COVID, well, I should be clear, working from home, most people so we've been surveying, we've surveyed around 30,000 Americans so far since the beginning of the pandemic. And there's a strong preference to work from home, typically 2-3 days a week. So some people want it full time, around a quarter of people never want to work from home again. They're like, I want to get back full time, but just over the majority of Americans want to work from home something like 2-3 days a week and want to go in the office 2-3 days a week. And that typically works well and will work well post-pandemic. When the kids are back at school, you have a social life on the evenings and the weekends. I can talk more about, but that's why most firms are heading there. That's the win-win situation. It's better for productivity, better for employees. It's a clear win-win. But under the pandemic, it's not great because, we're all crushed at home with people fighting for bandwidth and for space.
It's interesting. Harvard had done a survey. I don't know how big it was. It might just have been, it was by the business school. And the people that wanted to go back to workplace most were married couples and married couples with kids. So I think that bears out really what you're saying about that lack of division and space, headspace. So there's also some age and gender disparities we're finding in this. So a lot of people, as we know, moved back home during the pandemic, or others were forced to share their office, as you say, which became their bedroom. I think stats show 49% of workers logged in remotely from a dedicated room, but 51% were working from a bedroom or communal area. So struggling most, apparently, are the millennials. Is that true, Brad? Is that what you would say, that they've had a lot of stress?
Every time I talk to a person, whatever their situation is, they're the people that are suffering the most. If it's college freshmen, I can't get used to college. If it's college seniors, we're missing the prom and the graduation. So everybody, I think, has the unique perspective that the pain is mostly where I am. I think millennials are interesting because there are downsides for sure for working from home for millennials, even though you would think they would be the most technologically savvy and the most adept at this. I have a 25-year-old who works in my office, and she has 2 roommates in an apartment with 1 common space. So her entire life has been 24 hours a day working out of and sleeping in her bedroom. And I think that she's been quite honest with me that that's been really detrimental to her well-being. And she's really felt trapped in this bedroom as the only place where she can really work. She also counts on public transportation, and that has not been seen as being very safe. And so that's been difficult. But even in other times, I mean, millennials, I think what we forget, those of us, and I'll leave you out of this, Mary, but people like Nick and I who are older probably forget the fact that when we were in our 20s, especially if we moved to a new location after college or grad school, a lot of our social network was friends that we met in the workplace. And so social networking is extremely important to young people where, when you get to be my age, you think, oh, I like the quiet and the isolation. When you're 25 years old, you're not going to work to find quiet and isolation. So I think that's been difficult for a lot of them. The other thing is that we've done research on millennials and how they navigate their careers. And one of the things, the millennials get knocked with every rap, every negative cliche about what they don't do and how disloyal they are. But when we talk to them and interviewed over 1,000 of them, one of the things that was clear is these folks are really willing to work hard, put in the extra effort. They're very ambitious and all that kind of thing. But when we asked one question in our survey that was, are you willing to work hard and do all this stuff if it comes at the expense of your personal life? And the answer to that was, although 80 to 90% were willing to work hard, 20% said they were willing to work hard if it meant that they were going to compromise their personal life. And that was people with or without children. So I think millennials, they in spite of the fact that technology makes it difficult, I think they are very clear that they want to have a personal life and they want to have a life outside of work. And I think this blending of work and life in such an intimate way, the way it's gone over the past year has probably been difficult for those who want to say, I want to maintain a personal life and maintain an active, lifestyle beyond just my workday.
So talking about how productive people are working from home, Nick, I know there's a lot of bad mythology about people walking around in their pajamas all the time and having a great old time. So how much truth is there in that? Are people actually productive generally when they're working from home, or do they overwork? And are there good cost savings to be had by employers?
So, first thing to say is in terms of the amount of work, I've been looking at data from Microsoft, which is really interesting. They have, millions of companies' emails, instant messages, calendar entries. So it turns out if you look under the pandemic, people have worked a longer day based on when they first log in to when they log out. It's less clear they're working more hours, because I think what's going on for a lot of us was starting early and particularly ending later, but you're taking time out during the day. Would that time be counted as work time? So if I rang my friend from the office, it probably counts as work time. My friend comes around for an hour and we chat in my living room during the, pandemic, I guess, so they're vaccinated or something. But, that's looking ahead, that's not clear that's going to be counted as work time. But certainly the day has got longer. In terms of productivity, there's like a classic split here between short and long run. So short run, which is doing the same thing you've ever done before. Typically, I'm hearing overwhelmingly people are more productive. So, I've seen this in research. I'm running surveys of companies. In fact, earlier today, I was talking to a government office out in New Jersey. Actually, they were saying, look, one of the managers, she was saying her employees are basically doing the same old repetitive coding tasks. They'd be much more productive because you get peace and quiet at home and you avoid the commute. The problem in productivity is creativity, like new ideas and new innovation. So when I talk to managers, always they mention, the problem with having people at home 5 days a week is the lack of creativity and innovation. That always comes up first. Then they pretty rapidly move to talk about culture. So there's really a short and long run. We can kind of get by for 6 months, maybe even a year working from home, but it starts to really get costly in the long run. So that's why hybrid, which is, you're in the office 3 days a week, you're seeing each other, new ideas are coming up, you're, enmeshed in the work culture, but you get 2 days to quietly and productively work at home. It's really the best way to go.
What do you think of that 3-2 balance now? Particularly, let's think about women. How have they been doing during this period, Brad? Because a lot of the work has fallen to them, the parenting, the overseeing what's going on, the childcare. I'm not dissing you, Nick. I'm sure you're a very active father, but it does sometimes across the board fall to women to do that. And many of them lost their jobs that had childcare.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, women have not fared as well as you might imagine, and precisely because of their caregiving and homeschooling responsibilities. One study that was done by a couple of colleagues of mine looked at what were the percentage of households that were, how were they splitting up their responsibilities between men and women before the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, and then at the end of 2020. And what they found was there was an uptick of men getting involved and doing more on the home front in the first month or two of the pandemic. And, I think part of it was just the exposure to, oh my gosh, I didn't realize all this went on at home. And so now they were seeing it on a day-to-day basis. And so there was an uptick. And I think what's interesting, and we've been studying dads for a long time, is that people say, oh, men get applauded when they do things on the home front and women don't. That's only true if men only do it as an exception. Like, oh, today I'm going to the school play, tomorrow, next year I'm going to the soccer game. When men do things like that by exception, they are applauded. But when men are what they call conspicuous caregivers, they aren't applauded in the workplace any more than women are. And so, I think what happens is that a lot of times Organizations really force men to be closeted in terms of what they're doing on the caregiving front, out of fear that they won't be seen as a player or won't be seen as, as still as career oriented as they should be, because men, I think, are still much more susceptible to those cultural norms. But during this period of time, I hoped in the early days that the inflection point of seeing a little uptick in more egalitarian households and more men doing more would persist. But I think as the crisis turned into something that was not just a month or two, but really a long-term endeavor, unfortunately, I think men did men and women kind of both went back to more gendered roles. And I think the result of that has been women feeling more stress, more burnout, and they've been much more likely to voluntarily drop out of the workplace because of the pressures that they're under.
So how do we get away? You've just said it in a nutshell, really. There's still this kind of idea that men have to be seen to be earnest and engaged and care about work. That's very important in the general upper echelons of the work culture, I'd say. How can we change that? Because it inversely then says that women, if they prioritize children, are some sort of slackers, that they're not really into the work thing and they really like to work from home, which is actually not true.
No,
not for a lot of women.
I'll just give you one stat, and that is that when we look at men that we've researched over the years, 2/3 of the men in our studies consistently, and this goes back a decade, have said, I want to be an egalitarian caregiver. I want to be share caregiving with my wife 50-50. But when we say, oh, that's great, what is the reality? 1/3 of the husbands say it's egalitarian and 2/3 says she does more than I do. And so, it's really, I know this will sound like I'm splitting hairs, but it's less of a gender issue than it is a parental issue. In other words, like women and men do pretty well and pretty similarly as they come up in their early stages of their career. But once the children enter into the picture, then suddenly, both the organization starts to develop a mindset that these women are going to be less committed because they now have children. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest and research to suggest that that's true. Not only are women seen as less committed, but they're also sometimes seen as less competent when they have children. And there is research to bear that out from one of Nick's colleagues at Stanford, who developed that research scenario. But I think what happens is when they do, in addition to the organizational assumptions, there's also what's happening on the home front. And I think the thing that organizations can do best right now to try to battle that is to applaud men who are doing more on the home front. And one of the most visible ways they can do that right now is by offering like gender neutral paid leave for parents. And we see more and more organizations are starting to do that, the large organizations we work with. And surprisingly, men are, there used to be the old adage, you can offer men parental leave, but they'll never take it. That is not true anymore. And I think although that's only one part of obviously the parenting process and at the early stages of the lifespan, that is a very conspicuous way in which organizations can say, we know that men are as important as parents as women are, and we want to applaud the efforts of both genders to try to make this a more egalitarian kind of equation. So. Well,
I know that Nick's got 4 kids at home, so he probably does quite a fair amount of the shuttling and what have you, just because there's 4 of them, right? And do any of them drive?
Depends what you mean by drive. Yes, but,
not well.
Yeah, one of my oldest daughter, she drives. I'm not sure she particularly wants to drive on the freeway. It's an interesting thing as a Brit. The US system is not well set up to be egalitarian. It's more of a personal story, but for my wife and I, when we came over here in the UK, she was earning more than me and had basically a more high-flying job. We came over here and the combination of the tax system and work permits, school, very short day, the thing was really not structurally set up. As Brad says, there's actually no statutory maternity leave at the federal level in the US. It's kind of stumped. So in the UK, you get 6 months paid leave and another 6 months voluntary leave. So maternity leave is a big deal. And I was kind of hoping the current administration is what. In fact, oddly enough, how I got interested in working from home 15 years ago was noticing when we moved to the US, the difference between the UK and the US on maternity and paternity leave. And then wondering, well, look, some companies are really generous, like Netflix has incredibly generous maternity leave and other companies don't. and surely there must be a right or wrong answer in wanting to look into this, and discovered a whole bunch of stuff on work-life balance, like job sharing and part-time jobs and working from home as part of that package. Stuff I used to call being nice to you practices. Under the pandemic, working from home is a complete necessity. But pre-pandemic, it was part of a package of more, work-friendly practices. And it was interesting, it was hugely varied across companies. Typically, bigger, better managed companies would offer this. So pre-pandemic, it was normally, if you're well-run as a firm, you kind of saw it made sense to do it and you could handle it. And if you're badly managed, you tend to, be struggling to cope. But everything is completely different under the pandemic, obviously.
Interesting. So you were talking about the space between work and home, which some people have referred to as this sort of third zone. And I think it's interesting to talk about, it's not really been looked at how that affects you, that lack of definition of that's the end of the workday, that's the beginning of my life. And there's a transition that you're unable to have, coming home, stopping for a drink, unwinding, reprocessing in your commute, going to your hairdresser and having a talk about something or other. It's all this fabric of social connection that we've completely lost, particularly people that live alone, that they, start talking to their plants. So I'm just wondering, you've got this term, Brad, integrators and segmenters. What does that mean? Explain that to us.
So in the work-life field, there's a lot of conversation about how people like to work, what's their preference, what's their style of working, and so forth. And one of the kind of terms that people came up with is the idea of people who are segmenters versus people who are integrators. Integrators are the kind of people that, they log on at night at home, even pre-pandemic, they log on at night at home. They take personal phone calls in the workplace. They manage their calendars in one setting. They don't go to two different settings. And so they're people that say that, there's a sort of an easy flow between my work life and my home life, and they often flow into one another. Segmenters are people, and we may all know some of these people who, want to get to the office every day at 7:30 or 8:30 or whatever. They want to work their 8-9 hour day or whatever it is, and they want to leave and go home. And when they leave, they don't really necessarily want to bring the office with them. So they're people who really prefer to be working when they're working and at home when they're at home. The problem is now technology has forced many of us to be integrators, whether we want to be or not. And I think, this has been the great experiment in everybody being an integrator. And I think the thought that everybody's going to want to work from home or everybody's going to want to work flexibly or whatever ignores the fact there are some people that really view, the drive to work, as you said, as an opportunity to transition out of the thinking about getting the kids ready for school or whatever it might be. And it gives them time to kind of get into the work mindset. And then they get to work, they remain focused, and then they use the drive back as a way to kind of bridge themselves back into their personal lives. I think that the problem these days is that integrators are being forced into, segmenters are being forced into the role of everybody's integrated and work is all the time. And, instead of being, you can work anytime, anywhere, it's work all the time and everywhere kind of a thing. And so I think that, this pandemic has obviously exacerbated that, but I'm hopeful that people will be more conscious about the choices they make, not only individuals, but also managers and organizations, about, now that I've had an opportunity to work differently, what really makes sense for me, as opposed to just jumping to one conclusion or the other. And that's why, like Nick, I think the idea of hybrid work is really a good one. It offers more complexity for the organization, for the employer, but I think it also offers much more of a work and lifestyle that's amenable to today's families.
So I didn't know there was a choice about that business of not having to be working all the time. I thought that came with the terrain now, that you're always on call and people can send you texts at all hours.
Well, I have great admiration for my colleagues who don't answer their emails at home at night. And, they're usually the people who show up and be there at the office every day, but they're also the people when it's time to go home, it's time to go home. And I have great admiration for people who do that well.
Well, I think the French have done it really well. You're not allowed to send work emails on the weekend. Exactly. It's an offense in France.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great idea. I don't know if it's enforced, but it sounds like a great idea. So, Nick, going back to the office now. So physically, if we're only going to be in the office 3 days a week, a lot of things are going to change in city centres and office rentals. And has anyone looked into the sort of forecasting what that's going to do and impact?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So what has happened since the pandemic began is what's called the donut effect. So if you look at the 12 biggest US cities, which includes Boston, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, etc., you see the very city. So I'm going to give you data from two different sources. They give you the same story. So one is from Zillow, property price data, and the other is the US Postal Service. So we did a Freedom of Information Act and actually got this amazing information on change of address, net flows by zip code by month. And in both, you see the same story, which is city centers have seen massive drops in prices and flows of people out and businesses out. So something like since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen about 10 to 15% of individuals and businesses leave city centers. So like downtown Manhattan, central San Francisco, etc. So where have they gone? Turns out they've primarily gone to the suburbs of the same city. So you may think, obviously everyone's gone to Hawaii or Alaska or, Topeka, Kansas or somewhere far away. But no, and the reason is because the future is basically hybrid for most big firms. So if you've got to come into work 3 days a week, you can't do that from Alaska. You basically have to go out to the suburbs. So the hottest property markets across the US, anyone that lives in the suburbs of Boston, New York, San Francisco, they've seen their house prices explode because those are the hottest markets. The centers have done horribly. And further afield out in, second tier cities have done reasonably well, but, they're not massively up. So, it's kind of Econ 101. If I know post-pandemic, I'm going to come into work, let's say 3 days a week, I'm less bothered about a long commute, but I've still got to commute 3 days a week. And also slightly more bothered about having a bit of space at home to have a home office. So I move from, city center, I move 5-6 miles out to the suburbs. Vast numbers of people do that. That's what we're seeing. It's not terrible. So one point is, it sounds very negative. I'm not sure this is bad at all for city centers because they were becoming incredibly expensive. So the whole affordability crisis meant a lot of people just priced out the center of cities. And city centers, the low point was 1980. If you look at the center of American cities in 1980, they're pretty scary and dangerous. I remember visiting New York as a kid with my parents, going to Times Square, and this was like 82. And there were 2 security guards in the McDonald's with guns. I was like, not 1, but 2. Like, how dare you, why do you need to have openly holstered guns? Whereas, until the pandemic, Times Square was a very expensive, safe area. So you saw 40 years from 1980 to 2019, the city centers getting more and more expensive, upmarket. And then the pandemic has maybe knocked it back to 2005. So they're still expensive, but they're not as exclusive and as expensive as they used to be, like, 2 years ago.
But there's lots of things that you've brought up there that are, first of all, I wondered when the electoral votes were reconfigured recently, if that had had an impact on the census, because New York actually lost electoral votes, didn't it, in this rejigging of the electoral college? I think it's because everyone went to Long Island or New Jersey.
So, okay, great and fascinating point. So one of my colleagues here, Jonathan Rodden, had something in the New York Times last week about this. So for the for the census, mostly it was done in 2020. And so it probably didn't capture too much of the move, but some of the move it will have picked up. A lot of the moves we see are within state. So it doesn't tend to shift people across state boundaries. So for things like the presidential elections, it won't matter. But what it is going to matter for is things like local elections and House of Representatives. And Jonathan Rodden's point was interesting, which was there's been a massive amount of gerrymandering, as we know, over the last 2-3 decades. And the huge flows of basically blue voters out of city centers into suburbs has turned a lot of marginal suburbs that were kind of slightly reddish purple to slightly bluish purple. So it's actually going to have a big effect on the elections, because if you gerrymander, what you do is you create a bunch of marginals in your favor. And if suddenly a bunch of 20, 30-year-old Democrats flood in, it's going to flip things around. So a lot of the suburbs that were previously safe Republican seats may well actually swing Democrat because of these flows. But it's unlikely to, there's not a lot of flows across states, but it's heavily within states out to suburbs.
So what about the actual office thing? Because if you are going to work 3 days a week in New York City, this has happened to my son who used to live in Manhattan. He said, I'm just going to stay in a hotel. It's cheaper than renting an apartment to just come in and stay in a cheap hotel now, because hotel rates have gone way down. I think you're going to have a lot of empty office space, and people are going to want to have all this area around them now. And you have to book the elevator, right? Isn't there going to be a fast pass to get in the elevator at 8 o'clock in the morning? I mean, how is this going to work?
Look, I give you some, quick rundown on commercial property. Commercial property overall hasn't actually done too badly. Like, it's not great. I wouldn't want it to own a bunch of commercial property. It's down a bit. You'd think it would collapse because many more people are working from home. But there's one thing that's saving it, is that people don't want density. So, we don't want to be shoved next to people as dense as we were before the pandemic. So there's less people going in, but each person needs more space. And roughly, it's almost a wash. What has been absolutely massacred is skyscrapers. So city center skyscrapers are completely cursed because A, how do you get to the front door without taking mass transit and being crushed next to people in the subway? And then B, when you're at the front door, how do you get up to floor 50? Like, everyone, if you look at, as nerdy as I am, I've been reading these articles on elevators or lifts, as we would say, that there's a massive crush on the way up between 8:30 and 9 in the morning, down between 4:30 and 5. Most of the day they're empty, but it means that if you have a commercial building, you've got to stop people, as you say, coming up at 8:30 and going down at 4:30 to 5. And either you have the building half empty, or you start to charge people like airlines do. It costs more to fly on a Monday morning than Friday afternoon. So you say to your tenants, hey, look, we're going to halve your rates. You're going to pay half the amount before as you did for space. That's a great deal. But now every employee you have that goes up in the elevator at 8:30 to 9:30, we're going to charge you $5 for them. And you're going to find all kinds of things, like people start work earlier, they start work later, maybe apartments. So I think you're exactly right. Some of these office buildings are going to convert into apartments or mixed use or artist studios, different users, not basically 9 to 5 office workers, because they just can't handle that with the density in the elevators. And the subway, the subway has the same issue.
Yeah, Mary, one other thing is, when people think about how different work options, helped contribute to being able to be productive during the pandemic, there's a fixation or a preoccupation with people who work remotely or people who work from home. But, there are other forms of flexibility that are not as controversial sometimes as working from home, around when people start and stop their workday. And for some reason, organizations, have been kind of fixated with, well, we start at between 8 and 9 and we end between 5 and 6. And of course, what that's done, you think of it from the standpoint of traffic on the roads, but Nick's also referring to traffic in the elevators, which, now that I think of it, is probably almost as dangerous, if not more so. And you sit there and you think, why does it make sense for me to come in at 8 o'clock in Boston or in Palo Alto or New York, realizing that everybody else is heading in at exactly the same time? And we found that with parents who were at home, sometimes that was the thing they wanted. They were working from home, but maybe the husband would say, I'd like to work morning shifts. The wife would say, I'd like to work evening shifts or whatever. And by allowing them to flex their time, it also made things much more workable. And maybe when we think about people coming back into the city, maybe just not only in terms of, the breakdown between remote work and work in the office, but maybe we also ought to be thinking more about, would people prefer to come in at noon and work till 7 or 8 or whatever it might be? And if so, that could help to decompress the kind of situation that Nick's describing, and also the traffic that we've all had to deal with for years.
Brad, it's a great point. That I was thinking, as you talked about, that's not my parents. I grew up among 4 kids. Both my parents worked, and in order to deal with it, they worked offset hours and would take their offset holidays. So in some sense, we never really tended to have these big family holidays, but they kind of roughly covered it. You're exactly right. Yeah. It seemed kind of quirky, but it was, now I look back at it, that's how my parents handled this.
That's how they made it work. It's, shift work is something that a lot of lower income workers do use, where one works a day shift and one works a night shift. And it's a way to, cover everything and not pay the exorbitant childcare expenses that we see in this country.
I think there might be connected to the kind of type of industry you're in, that flexibility. I mean, it's already happening that the Goldman Sachs's and the formal bank institutions want the workers back in June, correct? Mm-hmm. But people like Google and Facebook are going to keep them virtual. So clearly, certain people want to work certain hours in certain industries. And that's because they're relating to other banks and other financial institutions. So I think there's a kind of club attached to that. I don't know how we shake up banks and financial. I don't think they're going to be shook up myself. I think they're pretty formal.
Yeah, Nick's the economist, so I'll let him explain how that works.
I was going to say, the big divide, Mary, on this is basically, do you have a college degree? Are you a kind of managerial professional job? For folks like that, which is honestly most people listening, they typically have been able to work from home. And those without, as Brad mentioned, frontline shift workers, et cetera, haven't really been able to. Now, within those that have a college degree, they haven't all been able to work from home. So one high profile group is in bankers, partly because, the guys trading, you need this very expensive high speed equipment. They have to do it from the office. Partly it's very sensitive, but they're not the only group. Other groups like dentists, I went to my dentist the other day, he couldn't work from home. Doctors, airline pilots. I don't know if anyone would willingly get on a plane where the pilot turns out he or she is sitting in their living room flying. There are certain high-end jobs that have to be done. They're not a big share though in the data. So Goldman Sachs, I know David Solomon at Goldman said working from home is an aberration. In some ways, investment banking is an aberration amongst college graduate jobs. So mostly it's middle management that can do, 3 days a week. As much as there are some low-paid jobs that can also work from home, it's not entirely. There are some kind of box checking, envelope stuffing jobs, but generally the college thing is by far the biggest divider. You see it, that graduates have on average had a better pandemic or get to work from home post-pandemic versus non-grads.
I'm glad you brought up the non-choice group, which is very important. It's a big section of the population. So this time last year, they were very essential workers. And now they're going back to being low skilled in their epithet. So I wonder how this is going to actually play out in the workplace, because I read a Washington Post piece, I think it was yesterday, and they were saying that some waitresses and childcare workers have found they're better off now being on unemployment, and they prefer not being abused by customers and all the other hassle they have to put up with, being a service job. And now they're looking at different work options. So do you think this is going to affect the professional workers who are dependent upon these people so they can do their job? I mean, they're all presuming that this childcare is going to open up and, that everything's going to be okay for them, but maybe that isn't going to be okay for them. Maybe there's less of them. I see there are lots of waitress jobs that have not been filled.
Right.
Brad, you're happy if you want to talk to this, I can do this, but
yeah, please.
It's kind of like, Mary, I'll be quick because it's kind of like the economic issue of our day. But just to give you, economics 101, right now, the US labor market is about as hot as it's ever been. So if you look at the total number of job vacancies in the US, it's higher than pre-pandemic by a lot. There's so many people when I talk to firms, they're desperate to hire people. Now, there's a huge debate, and it's very political, and I don't really want to take sides, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, as to why that is. The Democrats would say it's because people are worried about infection and because a lot of people have kids at home, so they can't go into work. The Republicans have tended to put more emphasis on unemployment. So there's a bunch of people that maybe get as much or more money being unemployed. And I'd say it's a quantitative debate. The unemployment issue kind of is going to expire anyway, because that extra benefit rolls off, I think, in September. Mm-hmm. So longer run, it's hard to tell. It is true that right now, actually, if you're a low skilled worker, your wage rate is relatively good if you want to go out and work. So that's the hottest part of the market in a kind of weird way. It was techies during the pandemic. But right now, your delivery drivers, waitresses, waiters, people in retail, actually those jobs are very, very hard to fill. I don't know.
Have their conditions gotten any better?
No, I mean, this is the odd thing. Their conditions are terrible. And if you're vaccinated, their conditions, if you're vaccinated, is probably similar to pre-pandemic. If you're not, I suspect it's far worse. There is a huge inequality issue pre-pandemic anyway. And, one of the major concerns is getting a bit off topic, but is amongst economists is the pandemic will lead us a big surge of automation. So the view was pre-pandemic, you go to Starbucks, you really want, the person handing you your coffee with a smile. Nowadays, you want a robot that hands you the coffee because you're worried about getting infected. Now that's true across every industry and business. Then you could see a massive increase in automation, and suddenly a lot of these low-end jobs disappear, and it raises inequality. So, I don't think that's an issue in the short run. I worry about that, honestly, within 10, 20 years. Going to kicked up a bit by the pandemic.
So we've got some questions that have come in. I don't know who wants to take them, but one person says, how can I convince my institution's HR department to adopt a flex work arrangement? Is this a problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much talk over the years about the business case for flexibility, and there are many, many different dimensions to that. I think there was a time when people thought, well, it was all about, saving commuting and having a more green environment and stuff like that. And then there was, this is an accommodation for working mothers. And then there were organizations that were global, and they said, well, we need people to work early mornings or late nights in order to be able to work across time zones and so forth. So, our center has certainly published information on how you can make the business case for this. But I'd say the strongest business case right now would be, I did it for the past 14 months, and I did it with my toddlers running around the room. So, I mean, if we could do it that way, why wouldn't it work going forward into the future? And so I think organizations that have said, oh, it was just a pandemic thing, and now it's time to get back to the real way we work, are probably a bit in the dark ages, except for those who obviously have jobs that are directly customer facing, like the ones that have been mentioned. But I think for the most part, I think we're going to have employees feeling more empowered to say, well, if it worked for 14 months and I was doing homeschooling and caregiving all day, then why wouldn't it work even that much better going forward? So I hope that kind of argument will carry some weight with business managers.
So someone else has said, can hybrid really work? I'll ask you this, Nick. Don't we all either need to be in the office or home on Zoom?
I firstly build on Brad. Brad has a fantastic amount of research in the center. We have a website, wfhresearch.com, where, similarly, there's a lot of op-eds and, pieces in like Harvard Business Review, the kind of things you can persuade managers for. It's also just clear that most firms are going to hybrid. So it's not like, strange, unusual companies, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Salesforce, HSBC, Citibank. All the big companies are basically announcing it. As for I think it's the best of both worlds. So just to be very clear, if you're in the office 3 days a week, let's say Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, the whole team comes in. That's like the exhaustingly social 3 days, because all your meetings, your client events, your training events, your leaving events, lunches, etc. there. And then your Wednesday, Friday, everyone goes home and they do all the quiet work, reading, report writing, analysis, preparing presentations. And you get 2 days of very productive stuff where you do your individual work and 3 days where you do your group work. And that, the case for hybrid work has been since the beginning of the pandemic. Like Facebook in May 2020 said that's what they're moving to. I wrote a blog piece supporting hybrid a year ago. I actually don't think it's remotely controversial anymore. That's why most companies are going there. It's kind of a done deal, to be honest. The issue now is on how many days and whether employees get choice on them.
Yeah. And just managing the complications. Things like saying everybody has to be available during certain hours of the day, or 1 day a week, or if we got the space, everybody will come into the office so we can do our social kind of activities and our meetings, something like that. You have to think it through a little bit more. It doesn't just, I think you wrote a piece, Nick, on how it's complicated. There's downsides.
Totally right. I totally agree.
But once you work through those initial complexities, I've managed this way since I was at HP, 30 years ago, and it works. It's just a matter of saying, get over the initial bumps, figure out a pattern that works, and then go with it.
And so all the introverts can come in on the 2 days a week.
Exactly.
Everybody else.
You joke, but as Brad says, I'm totally aligned. So hybrid is the way forward, but it's complicated. It is not easy, and you need there's various rules. Like everyone has to come in on the same 3 days, and otherwise you'll get the introverts choose the off days, but has to stay home. One of the things that's important, you have to stay home on the other 2 days, because otherwise, what happens is the ambitious single young men all come in and use it as a way to cozy up to the boss and get ahead. So I remember listening to one tech CEO say it's got to be driven from the top. The CEO says, all of you guys come in 3 days a week, I'm going to be in 5. You can imagine it unravels and the thing falls apart. So it's got to be driven properly from the top, that you deliberately stay at home on those 2 days. Everyone has to be home. No backsliding, I think, is the answer.
Okay, we got another question. Urs asks, what are the prospects of a vast increase in shared jobs, particularly for parents during child rearing years?
Like job sharing, do they mean?
Yeah.
We've studied flexibility for a long time, as Nick has, and we look at it a lot in terms of, what kind of configurations can be used to create more flexible workplaces. And I got to say, job sharing has never really taken root. It's a very small percentage of people who actually do what you would consider a real job share, where two two people are doing one job and both of them working half or 60% time or whatever it might be. I think job sharing is complicated because of the handoffs that have to go between people. If one person moves on into another job, what happens to the job share? And I think there's just a lot of suspicion about whether, it's easier to point your finger at one person and say, get this done, than it is to say, well, who's getting this done that day? So Nick may have a different opinion, but job sharing has never been one of the most popular forms of flexibility. And I don't think that there's anything about the pandemic which has made it more desirable than it was before.
No, I agree. Claudia Goldin at Harvard's done a lot of work on it, and she points out it kind of works for, I'm totally aligned with you. And she said, it's kind of works really only for jobs that are modular. So like for low skilled jobs, you work hour by hour, it doesn't really matter. Like if you're shoveling dirt, you can do 4 hours or 8 hours, the amount of output. But if for that, the kind of higher skilled jobs, it's things like family doctors, pharmacists, pilots. Like if you're a pilot, you can fly 2 days a week. It doesn't matter so much if you maybe don't fly, 4 days a week, or if you're a family doctor, you can be on for 3 days. But most jobs, it's kind of hard. Like if you're a manager, so, Mary, imagine you're my manager and you're only there half the week and Brad's the other half. You may have told me something, and then I come in and I talk to Brad and I'm like, but wait a minute, it's very complicated. So it turns out it really only works for jobs that you work on that hour, and they tend to be professional specialist type jobs. So Claudia Goldin at Harvard, they're 5-10% of the top end labor market, so they're hard to find. And absolutely, as Brad says, because of that, they don't tend to have taken off. Yeah. If you look for them, it's more like at the age of 20 or 21, you choose those careers so that it works for it. It's harder in your 40s to move across to something that's job sharing.
Yeah, I think compressed work weeks is got more potential. People working 4 by 10 or whatever, 9 days out of every 2 weeks. I think that's something that a lot of people would love to do because they're still getting full-time pay, but they're able to have a day free a week or a day free every other week. And I think that kind of thing, there are industries obviously that do that, and trucking and nursing and all kinds of, the healthcare professions where the people do those kinds of hours. And I think that that probably has more potential in the long run than something like job sharing.
I think there's a lot of really, really hard communicating has to go on for it to work. I did do a job share when I worked in television. I worked 2.5 days a week and the other person worked 2.5 days a week. But you have to, as you say, if anything falls through the cracks, you're completely, because they'll say it was the other person. Then you got a problem. So
I wouldn't do that, but maybe
yeah, well, it worked for me at the time. It was the only option. Somebody else has said, is the office, since it represents a particular structure of power and the institutions of late capitalism, is this the end of capitalism?
That's, I don't know. That's definitely for Nick.
Oh, I like it. I love these questions. They remind me of when I was back at the LSE. I was at the LSE in London, and there was a big Fabian Street there. I'm not sure the pandemic so much, but there has been a broad move away from, full-throated capitalism. For example, obviously, the response to the pandemic, massive government spending, a lot of stimulus checks, repeated stimulus checks. I would say politics and economics is moved a bit more to the center. What I'd call free market economics, it's still kind of broadly popular, but there's a bit of retrenchment. A big driving factor of that, by the way, has been rising inequality. So the big reason is from 1980 to now, inequality has risen incredibly, in a very depressing way. I think in the US, 40% of wealth is held by the top 1% of people. And because of that, we want to do something to address it. And I suspect the Biden administration is going to move further down that path. So tax rates for the top end will go up. So I'm not so sure it's due to the pandemic. The pandemic's kind of nudged in that direction, but it was heading already that way, I think, in 2019.
Yeah, I agree.
Could you both, before time's ticking away here, we were going to talk about future trends, what this might create for us going forward, this new work world. And you said that there were certain risks attached to diversity and inequality, which you just alluded a little bit to. Could you talk a little bit more about that, about what your concerns are?
Well, I might be saying something different when I talk about diversity. I'm talking more in this perspective of race. racial diversity or gender diversity or whatever. Or, my fear is that, and obviously maybe Nick could speak to the fact that, persons of color oftentimes don't have the same financial means. They don't have the same ability to have good office setups and office equipment and all that kind of thing. They live in tighter boundaries. And so it's much more difficult for them to just say, oh, I'll create a home office or whatever it might be. But my concern around, especially racial minorities, is that, they'll find themselves, they've always struggled to have a network and to be visible and to connect with mentors because of the fact that they don't see people who look like them necessarily in the hierarchy. And the fear is if they're working more remotely, that will be even more difficult than it's been in the past. And we all know that networks are a critical piece of people's career advancement. You're better off being well networked than competent, I think, unfortunately, oftentimes, if you want to get ahead, quote unquote. And that's not just me saying that. I mean, there's actually some truth to that. So my fear is that those people who struggle to find natural networks and struggle to find allies and mentors and sponsors might be even more disadvantaged if they're working outside of the office for extended periods.
Nick, do you have anything to add to that about the things that may develop, trends that may develop as a result of this new transition?
Yeah, I mean, so the front line on management challenges. I talked to a huge number of organizations about working from home. And I mentioned that, Brad and I kind of align that hybrid is the way. The big division line right now, the big challenge for people talking to their bosses or the other boss is over how much choice to give people in your team. So, I remember talking to someone pretty senior in a tech firm. She said, look, as long as my employees are getting their job done, they can work from home 5 days a week or 1 day a week. It's up to them. They're adults. They're doing a good job. Come in whether or which days they want. The other view is more about centralization. It's against choice, and it arises out of concerns, partly of a mixed mode. It doesn't work so well in some people in the office and some at home, but more about concerns over diversity. So why don't I explain the diversity thing? If you look in our data, what you see is, for example, who wants to work from home post-pandemic isn't random, the number of days they choose. So if you look at college graduates who have children in the household that are 12 or under, women have a 50% higher rate of wanting to work from home full-time than men. You look at people that live far from the office, or people say that are disabled, they have a higher preference to work from home. Now, so that's fine. I mean, that's kind of in the data, and there's variations and preferences. Why that makes it problematic is other research, and it's probably not surprising to anyone that's listening, shows that if you are working from home in a team where most people are going in every day, you suffer in promotion. And actually, I did a study out in China where we randomized volunteers into working from home. And after 21 months, people working from home 4 days a week had half the promotion rate, so a massive drop. So if you put those two facts together, you could easily find, if you as a manager say, hey, you guys, you decide who comes in and who doesn't. 5 years later, it's all single young men that come in and are promoted, and people with young kids, people living far away, disabled people aren't. So this is why my preference has been for managers to set the days within the team and force everyone not only to come in on those 3 days, but also to stay at home on, say, the other 2 days. Because otherwise I have a horrible fear that this could lead to a diversity crisis and also endless lawsuits. I mean, if people sue the company, they'd be appropriate to do it. You'll find that if you allow people to choose, this thing will play out as you predict. So I would stay well away from that. I think it's very problematic, allowing people to choose how many days they come in. I think a team plan seems, in the short run at least, clearly the best thing to do.
That's fascinating, very fascinating. But it's definitely true, you become invisible if you're not in the office.
Yeah, totally. One of my friends said, oh yeah, we have someone that, they're in Denver. This is a friend of mine that works in a big company out in the Bay Area, and said, oh yeah, that guy, he knows he's never going to get promoted. He's just taking the hit, which I don't think seems reasonable, and we certainly don't want it post-pandemic.
And particularly that's always the women's issue, that they're already struggling to make themselves like seen.
Yeah,
and if they check out and stay home, they're going to be passed over.
It turns out in our survey data, people without kids, there's no gender differential. It's with young kids, particularly college grads with young kids. Yeah. So it's, someone that left university, they're now 33 and have a 5-year-old. That's where, in fact, men within that group have a higher preference, linked to what Brad was saying earlier. Men have a higher preference to come into work within that group than men without kids, whereas women with young kids have a higher preference to work from home. So that's the critical group. But they tend to be, 30-somethings come out of university and with young families. So that's very sensitive in that demographic.
So I know that you've got a hard stop coming up very, very shortly, Nick. So before before I do my closing address, I wanted to thank you both for this really, really interesting, valuable discussion from all the perspectives about this work-life balance equation, which I think is going to be an ongoing one. I think we're in a transition period now, and some things are probably not going to work and some things will. So, so thank you, Nick, for joining us from Stanford. And thank you, Brad, joining us from Boston College, or wherever it is you have your office. And I'm going to thank all of the listeners now and viewers for coming into Cambridge Forum's discussion today and the end of the office and post-pandemic work life. We had Nick Bloom, Professor of Economics at Stanford, and Brad Harrington, Executive Director of the Center for Work and Family at Boston College. So I'd like to say goodbye to everyone, and a very big thanks again to Nick Bloom, Brad Harrington. We'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's fantastic. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Mary.
Great conversation, Mary and Nick. Thank you.